Well, welcome, Abigail Garner. I'm glad that you could spend some time at HRC and share with us some updates from what's been happening since families like mine hit the scene in 2004, and talk a little bit about where you're going next in your life, because I know you're in a transitional stage. I read this book in 2004, and when I read it, my oldest child was 3. And I found it fascinating, and I learned a lot from the book that helped me in my professional role, which was counseling prospective gay and lesbian parents and running maybe baby groups. And the stories you brought to life through this book helped me to push folks in those groups to think not just about how they wanted to create their families and the actual process of bringing children into their lives, but what might it be like for our children, and how should we prepare ourselves to be the best parents we can be, knowing that our children are going to be facing some hostility and scrutinized and stigmatized. And it was really wonderful for me. It was such a great tool and had been such a missing piece of the work our community had been doing. But I realized lately that it's had more personal resonance for me now that my older daughter is approaching 3rd grade, and I'm very hyper aware of the fact that there are going to be some specific bumps and bruises along the road because she has 2 moms. And I'm starting to remember a lot of these voices and say, yes, that's exactly what Abigail was saying. So I want you to tell me what inspired you to write the book, and what kind of stories and feedback you hear from people like me, for whom this book is sort of a must-read.
You hit a number of important points about why I did write the book. I grew up in a family where my dad came out when I was 5 years old, and I felt like there was nothing growing up that reflected my experience, whether that be television shows or discussion on the news or even billboards or commercials. So as I was growing up, I was still feeling like there needed to be that reassurance, that reflection of my family, and it simply wasn't there. So I wrote the book that I always wished had been there for me and my family. But what you mentioned before about so much of the focus in LGBT parenting groups is about overcoming the barriers that are often in the way to becoming parents when you're not heterosexual. And for me, as one of these children that has now grown up in the community, I want to encourage parents to be saying, then what? If we're so focused on that barrier, what happens when we do overcome that barrier? That's when the real questions and the real challenges begin. But that it's so much more than LGBT people wanting to be good parents for the sake of being good parents, but for them to nurture their children along the way. And so many times when there are challenges, that internalized homophobia clicks in for parents to say, oh no, people are going to think I'm a bad parent, people are going to say I shouldn't be a parent, when that should not be the focus of what's going on at that moment. The focus should be what's happening with the child and how can we best nurture that child.
Well put. The best interest of the child should always be the guiding
principle.
principle.
And that's even hot-button language for our families, is that we always have the right wing interpreting the best interest of the children, which again is one of the reasons why I spoke up, is to say, stop assuming what's in the best interest of my family. The best interest of the children is not to be continually politically terrorized by saying that we shouldn't have gay and lesbian parents. The best interest of our children is to be loved and nurtured in their families and left alone by politics.
Did you recall feeling ashamed or embarrassed or uncomfortable over the course of your childhood or young adulthood because you had a gay father? And if so, did you speak it? How did you express it? What did you do with that?
So you said ashamed, embarrassed, or uncomfortable. 3 very different things on the spectrum of how kids respond to things. And it's going to be really different depending on where they are in their developmental stages. So I think for my family and a lot of other parents that the misstep they might take is to take a mental snapshot of where a child is at a certain point. So you might say, my 5-year-old is fine with having a lesbian mom. In fact, she was bragging to the guy at the deli counter about it, and never thinking that it's going to be an issue from then on. Never mind that then in 5th grade, someone says, "What do you mean your mom's lesbian?" And there starts to get some teasing, and suddenly she's going to be more careful about who she tells. The word ashamed, I think, is often labeled for the feelings that kids have when they choose not to be telling the world every day. And it's really not about shame for us. It's about being safe and navigating that level of safety. And for any LGBT person who can identify with the experience of walking into a room every time, every new space, and making that split-second decision, how out am I going to be? Now imagine, without all the developmental skills that you have as an adult, and put that onto a 7-year-old who has now heard various politicians say that their family is not worthy, and saying very drastic things about what should happen to the future of these families. That is what teaches us at a young age to try to figure out, to navigate that world of homophobia bit by bit and coming out carefully. It's often interpreted as shame, but it's not. It's just how we are using the developmental skills that we have.
It's a great reframing, because I think we forget that our children actually will be out. They can't hide who their families are. And it's funny, because the 5-year-old example you gave, I mean, all 5-year-olds brag about everything, so it makes a lot of sense. How do parents, what advice do you have, just from your own experience and from hearing from so many folks, what advice do you give to parents about how we can best support and help and provide the best possible circumstances for our children to be as comfortable and as safe in the world as they can be?
First and foremost, we have to give the kids the words to be able to talk about their families, and in a way that your family is okay with. One common misstep that I see that parents do is they say, well, I don't really like to label myself. What my partner and I have is a relationship. We don't want to label it like that. It's just love. Well, abstract terms for adults, abstract understandings, that might work. But for this 6-year-old that's on the playground and people are saying, "Are your dads gay?" and suddenly that child doesn't know if they can say yes or no, if they're not supposed to say it because they don't have the words or because their parents are trying to hide it. So in that kind of scenario, the parents need to say, some people would see this and they'd say, "We're gay." If someone asks it, it's okay. Some people would see us and call it a gay family. So giving them the words and translating that, even if there's a political identity that doesn't exactly fit with playground terms, because you've got to give the kids the tools that match their developmental skills.
I have heard from many parents that they've been absolutely shocked and hurt when they're at some point a child or both of their children, if they have more than their children, say, "I really don't want you to come and be at my school," or "I'd really rather you didn't, I don't really want my friends to meet you." And sometimes that doesn't really come up until kids are older, but one of the stories I read, and I know this came up a bit in your book, but I read something more recent on a webpage that a mother was struggling because her 11-year-old son said something like, I don't want my friends to meet you because you're so masculine. There was an issue around the sort of how his mother's gender expression would be perceived. And my sense is that when children start to get into adolescence and they have their own sort of awareness of sexuality and gender, and the name calling around that stuff gets really intense, that's maybe where there's some dissonance around their comfort level and their comfort being kind of associated with a gay family.
It's difficult to separate a lot of times what has to do with having gay parents and what has to do with being a teenager. So sometimes it's hard for parents to be able to discern that. An example being if a son of lesbian mom says, "I don't want you kissing me anymore when you drop me off at school." A lesbian mom might internalize that and say he's ashamed of having a lesbian mom, or she might realize he's turning 11 or 12 and that's no longer something that he wants to do, and that's a developmental thing. So you have that piece of it. But the other thing is figuring out those boundaries for yourself as you're growing up. And I think it's really important for parents to be able to, what I call the crushed parent look, to be able to hide that the look of this is really hurting me, because once kids see that, then they try to protect their parents from everything else they're experiencing, and it closes down that communication. And so it's important for parents when their kid says, I don't want my friends coming over. I understand that that's how you feel about it now. We'll talk about this next winter. We'll talk about this when school's out. We'll check in about this again, so that the child knows that the door is open. They don't have to stay stubborn and say that this is how it's going to be forever, but that it's a temporary situation and not a reflection on the gender expression or identity politics of their parents.
You spoke in Minnesota recently at the Rainbow Families Conference, and I know that's sort of your home base. You talked about how our children fit into the LGBT community, and how we, what language we use, and how we define you, and how you define yourselves. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about some of the ways in which our children, especially your generation, feel sometimes alienated and marginalized from this community. Yet you have a very different, visceral kind of an emotional connection to the community.
Yeah, I think it's really easy to identify any heterosexual who's supportive of LGBT issues as an ally. And this is what happens to so many of these children, is that now we've spent 2 decades producing research that says that children of LGBT parents are no more likely to turn out to be LGBT themselves. And we've had to do that to satisfy homophobic court systems, because that was in order to get gay and lesbian people to keep custody of their children in cases of divorce after coming out. That message is that the children are going to be straight. There's pride in that, which is inherently homophobic. I hear it touted all the time. Yet where are those straight children? And for me, growing up, now as I'm an adult, there's so few of us that are actually involved in the LGBT community, much because we are often labeled as outsiders. So we grow up culturally queer. We grow up within the LGBT community on the front lines, because there's a family tree project in kindergarten, that we are finding those words, and we are de facto educators and ambassadors every day. Yet we turn 18, leave the house, go off into the world, and because we're straight, we're suddenly labeled allies. Allies are important, but for us as children of these families, we don't identify as allies. That puts us on the outside of a community that we're a part of. And for us to go into the straight world, where we are translating things, we are outsiders to that world, and we're viewed as that too. We are viewed as the people who are different, the people who have weird values, yet within our own community we're considered outsiders as well. So it's that caught between two worlds experience that really makes me advocate for thinking into the long-term future. I know it's very difficult for parents with a 6-month-old to start contemplating her future identity politics, but that's what we need to do, is say, what do we want the LGBT community to look like 10, 20, 30 years from now, when we have millions of culturally queer, erotically straight children in our own community?
I love those terms. I remember listening to NPR a couple years ago, and the reporter had attended the Provincetown Family Week, and she was interviewing a teenager who used that exact term. He said, "I'm straight, but I'm culturally queer." And I thought, wow, our kids, they're really living in two worlds, or sometimes more than two worlds. I mean, it depends on their cultural and ethnic identity, and whether they're adopted and have, other sort of layers. But being culturally queer, I had thought about that. You don't just turn 18 and you're done. It's always a part of who you are. I mean, you probably know more about Judy Garland than the average, 34-year-old straight woman. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And I find that the experience of giving people that language, offering culturally queer to other sons and daughters that have LGBT parents, their reaction is exactly what mine was, which was relief. That I was not the freak that I thought I was, and that language meant that this was enough of a phenomenon that someone had taken the time to put words to it. and that validated my existence. And no longer did I feel like I was whining in some kind of cultural exile, or some kind of, I should say, emotional exile, but I knew that that was my way of putting words to homesickness as an adult.
Well, I know that you made a proclamation recently that you are retiring, and I was very envious at 34 you're retiring, but then I listened to the rest of the sentence. Retiring from being a spokesperson, or at least primarily in that role as spokesperson for adults who grew up with gay and lesbian parents. And I just wondered if you can say a little bit about how you came to that decision, what your hope is for the sort of the next leaders to come, and what you plan to do next.
My mission since the very beginning has been to bring voice to the experience of people who have LGBT parents and to decrease their invisibility. And I have spent 12 years doing that. I think that it's really important if my mission is to increase those voices, is to get out of the way, to make sure that there's space for more people. I interviewed over 50 sons and daughters in my book, Families Like Mine, and I know dozens others. But sometimes I think there's a sense that this is my territory, and I never want any movement to be too closely connected to any one person, because that will limit it. And I know that there are going to be younger people coming up through the advocacy ranks, if that's how they choose to be present and involved in the LGBT community. And I know they're going to have ideas that I don't agree with, and I know there are going to be things that I'm uncomfortable with, and I want to make sure that they have those opportunities to experiment with new ideas. And I've written my stuff down. I calculated that between my blog and my book and my columns, I've written over 500,000 words for gay families, and I look forward to seeing the new energy that comes forward.
Well, thank you for your contribution. I know for me this has been a really terrific gift, and it came at a very critical time, and I always highly recommend to parents to read this book, not to wait until your kids are 7 or 11 or 15, but to integrate some of these concepts and some of this broader thinking about the responsibility we're taking on as LGBT parents. So thank you for this, and good luck with your future endeavors.
Thank you, Ellen.